The blood on the snow told a story that shouldn't have been possible. There, in the heart of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, a massive grizzly bear lay helpless against a fallen log, his once powerful frame trembling with exhaustion. Around him, 7 gray wolves moved like shadows through the swirling snowfall, their yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intent. This was supposed to be the end, the final chapter of a bear's story written in crimson against the pristine white canvas of winter. But what happened next would challenge everything we thought we knew about the brutal laws of the wild. Because sometimes, even in nature's most merciless moments, something extraordinary breaks through the darkness. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. Let me take you back to where this incredible story began. His name was Bruno, though of course he didn't know that's what the researchers who'd been tracking him for 3 years had called him. To them, he was Bear 247, a magnificent male grizzly who ruled over nearly 40 square miles of pristine Alaskan wilderness. But Bruno seemed to fit him better. There was something almost regal about the way he carried his massive 800-pound frame through the dense forests and rocky outcroppings of Denali National Park. Bruno wasn't just any bear. He was a legend among both the scientific community and the local guides who knew these mountains like the back of their weathered hands. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist who'd been studying the park's grizzly population for over a decade, often spoke of Bruno with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural wonders. "I've never seen a bear quite like him," she would tell visitors to the research station. "He's got this presence about him. Other bears, even large males, give him a wide berth. It's not just his size, though he's certainly impressive in that regard. It's something deeper, an intelligence in his eyes that's almost human." Bruno had earned his reputation the hard way. Born during one of the harshest winters on record, he'd survived when many of his siblings hadn't. His mother, an experienced sow named Bella by the research team, had taught him the ancient secrets of survival in this unforgiving landscape. How to fish for salmon in the rushing streams when they returned from the ocean each summer. Where to find the richest berry patches that would help him build the fat reserves necessary to survive hibernation. Which roots and grasses provided the nutrients his massive body required. But more than that, she taught him something that would prove invaluable in the years to come: the delicate balance of showing strength without unnecessary aggression, of commanding respect without picking fights that didn't need to be fought. As Bruno matured, those lessons served him well. He became known for his unusual behavior around other animals. While most grizzlies were solitary creatures, quick to chase away any perceived threat, Bruno seemed to have developed a more nuanced understanding of his domain. Rangers reported seeing him sharing fishing spots with black bears, something almost unheard of among large male grizzlies. He'd been observed allowing smaller animals to forage nearby without the typical explosive charges that characterize territorial disputes. It was like he understood he was so dominant that he didn't need to prove it constantly, explained Jake Peterson, a park ranger who'd been working in Denali for 15 years. Most big males are constantly fighting, constantly asserting their dominance. Bruno just existed, and somehow that made him even more intimidating. This gentle giant approach had worked beautifully for Bruno through 7 successful seasons. He'd never been seriously injured, never lost a significant territorial dispute, and had successfully mated with several females over the years. Life was good for the undisputed king of this corner of Alaska. But, as we all know, the wilderness has a way of humbling even the mightiest of creatures. October 15th started like any other day in Bruno's domain. The first snows of winter had begun painting the landscape in brilliant white, and Bruno was engaged in the crucial business of hyperphagia, the intensive feeding period that would determine whether he'd survive the long winter months ahead. He'd been fishing at his favorite spot along Clearwater Creek, a deep pool where the salmon still ran thick despite the approaching winter. Bruno was a master fisherman, his massive paws capable of snatching 20-pound salmon from the rushing water with the precision of a surgeon. On this particular morning, he'd already caught and consumed 4 large fish, their rich oils adding precious pounds to his winter reserves. But something was different about this day. The forest felt wrong somehow. Birds that should have been active were silent. Even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted. Bruno's keen senses, honed by years of survival in the wild, picked up on these subtle changes. His massive head lifted from the water, dark eyes scanning the tree line with newfound alertness. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in his peaceful domain, the distant rumble of human machinery. Bruno had encountered humans before, of course. The researchers who'd tagged and tracked him for 3 years had always been respectful, maintaining their distance and never posing a threat. The occasional hiking group that passed through his territory was usually loud enough that he could avoid them entirely. This was different. This sound spoke of larger numbers, of different intent. What Bruno couldn't have known was that an illegal hunting operation was moving through the park. 3 men from out of state, armed with high-powered rifles and an arrogance that bordered on stupidity, had decided that poaching a trophy grizzly would be the perfect way to cap off their Alaskan adventure. The leader of this group was a man named Rick Turner, a real estate developer from Texas who collected hunting trophies the way some people collect stamps. He'd heard stories about the legendary bear of Denali, and his ego simply couldn't resist the challenge of taking down what locals called the king of the mountain. What Turner and his companions lacked in wilderness knowledge, they made up for in dangerous overconfidence. They'd hired a corrupt local guide, a man who'd lost his legitimate guiding license years earlier due to safety violations. Together, this group represented everything that responsible hunters and conservationists despised about trophy hunting. Bruno caught their scent before he saw them. The smell of gun oil, synthetic fabrics, and human sweat carried on the wind. These weren't researchers or park rangers. These were predatory of a different kind, and they were hunting him. His instincts screamed at him to disappear into the dense underbrush, to use his intimate knowledge of the terrain to simply vanish until these intruders moved on. It's what he'd done dozens of times before when faced with potential human conflict. Bruno was smart enough to know that avoiding confrontation was always the wisest choice. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Bruno began his strategic retreat, moving with surprising silence for such a massive creature, the forest around him erupted in chaos. The hunters had split up, trying to drive him toward a predetermined kill zone. In their amateur enthusiasm, they'd made noise, lots of it. And that noise had awakened something else in the forest. A sow grizzly with 2 yearling cubs had been denning in a cave system less than half a mile away. The commotion had startled her from her pre-hibernation rest, and now she was moving through the forest with her cubs, desperately trying to get them to safety. Bruno heard her distress calls before he saw her. Every instinct in his body told him to keep moving, to save himself. Sows with cubs were notoriously dangerous, even to large males like himself. Getting involved would only complicate his own escape. But then he saw them. The mother bear, who the research team had designated as Bear 341, was limping badly. Her left rear leg had been caught in an old illegal snare sometime in the past, one of dozens that Turner's group had scattered throughout the area despite the severe federal penalties for such actions. The wire had cut deep into her leg, and infection was clearly setting in. Behind her, two small cubs, probably born just that past January, stumbled through the snow on legs not yet fully adapted to the harsh realities of Alaskan winter. They were crying constantly, high-pitched distress calls that would carry for miles in the thin mountain air. Bruno stopped. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the big bear's decision-making process. Later, Dr. Mitchell would theorize that what happened next demonstrated a level of cognitive complexity in grizzlies that science was only beginning to understand. But in that moment, standing in the swirling snow, with the sound of human voices growing closer, Bruno made a choice that would change everything. He turned toward the sound of the struggling family. The wounded mother saw him approaching and immediately went into defensive mode, despite her injuries. She reared up on her hind legs, all 400 pounds of maternal fury, and let out a roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Her message was clear: stay away from my cubs. But Bruno didn't approach with the typical posturing of a male grizzly. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, his massive head lowered in what animal behaviorists would later recognize as submissive body language. He was communicating something unprecedented in the world of grizzly bear interactions: I'm here to help. What happened next was captured by one of the hunter's trail cameras, footage that would later become crucial evidence in their prosecution. Bruno positioned himself between the wounded family and the approaching hunters. His massive frame, standing nearly 10 feet tall on his hind legs, created an imposing barrier that even the most confident poacher would think twice about crossing. For nearly 20 minutes, this standoff continued. The hunters, suddenly faced with not one but two adult grizzlies, and having no idea that one was wounded, began to reconsider their illegal enterprise. Voices could be heard on the camera footage arguing about whether to proceed or retreat. It was during this tense standoff that everything went wrong. Turner, frustrated by his companion's growing reluctance and driven by an ego that simply couldn't accept defeat, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot wasn't meant to kill. Even Turner wasn't quite that reckless. He later claimed he was trying to scare the bears away. But his aim, affected by adrenaline and inexperience with large game in harsh conditions, was off by several crucial inches. The bullet struck Bruno in his left shoulder, tearing through muscle and sinew before lodging against his shoulder blade. The impact spun the massive bear around, sending him crashing into the snow with a roar of pain and confusion that seemed to shake the very mountains themselves. The wounded mother bear, already stressed beyond her limits, took this as her cue to flee with her cubs. She disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only the fading sound of her distressed calls and the metallic scent of fear. Bruno lay in the snow, trying to process what had just happened to him. The burning pain in his shoulder was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Blood seeped into the white snow beneath him, creating an expanding crimson stain that seemed to mock the purity of the wilderness around him. The hunters, suddenly faced with the reality of what they'd done, panicked. This wasn't the clean, quick kill they'd fantasized about. This was a wounded, dangerous predator in his own territory, and they were woefully unprepared for the situation they'd created. They ran. Not just retreated, ran. Like the cowards they'd always been beneath their bravado, they abandoned their wounded quarry and fled the scene, leaving Bruno to deal with the consequences of their arrogance alone.
For the first hour after the shooting, Bruno lay motionless in the snow. The shock of the bullet's impact, combined with the sudden surge and crash of adrenaline, had left him disoriented and weak. Blood continued to seep from his wound, and with each passing minute, his strength ebbed away like water through cupped hands. But Bruno was a survivor. He'd lived through 7 brutal Alaskan winters, survived territorial disputes with other large males, and overcome injuries from hunting mishaps and falls. Deep in his core, something fundamental refused to give up. Slowly, painfully, he struggled to his feet. The bullet had done significant damage. His left front shoulder screamed with agony every time he tried to put weight on that leg, and the wound itself was bleeding steadily. Worse, the bullet's impact had damaged the complex network of muscles and tendons that allowed his massive frame to move with the fluid grace that characterized healthy grizzlies. But Bruno began to walk. Each step was an exercise in determination. His normal fluid gait had been replaced by an awkward 3-legged hobble that would have been comical if it weren't so heartbreaking. He needed to find shelter, somewhere he could rest and allow his body to begin the healing process. The nearest suitable denning site was nearly 3 miles away, a journey that would normally take Bruno less than an hour. In his wounded state, it became an epic odyssey that stretched across 2 days. He moved mostly at night, when the forest was quieter and the risk of encountering other predators was reduced. During the day, he sheltered under fallen logs or in the lee of large boulders, conserving his strength and allowing his body precious time to rest. The bleeding eventually stopped, but infection began to set in. Bruno's normally pristine brown fur became matted with dried blood and debris. His magnificent frame, which had commanded respect from every creature in his domain, began to show the effects of his ordeal. Weight dropped off his massive body as his wounded state made foraging nearly impossible. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Bruno's journey wasn't physical, it was psychological. For the first time in his adult life, the king of the mountain was vulnerable. Every sound in the forest now carried potential threat. Every shadow could hide danger. The confidence that had defined his existence had been shattered by a single gunshot, and rebuilding it would prove even more difficult than healing his physical wounds. On the second night of his journey, Bruno encountered his first real test. A small pack of wolves, 4 animals, led by an experienced alpha male, picked up his scent near Wolverine Ridge. In his healthy state, Bruno wouldn't have given a second thought to a pack this size. A few aggressive charges, some intimidating roars, and they would have melted back into the forest like smoke. But these wolves could smell his blood. They could see his weakness in every labored step. What should have been a routine encounter between apex predators became an hours-long game of cat and mouse, with Bruno desperately trying to reach higher ground while the wolves testing his defenses. He managed to escape that encounter, but it cost him dearly. The exertion reopened his wound, and precious energy reserves were depleted. More concerning, word was spreading through the forest's invisible communication. The king was wounded. The monarch is vulnerable. By the time Bruno finally reached the cave system he'd been aiming for, he was barely recognizable as the magnificent creature who'd ruled these mountains for so many years. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and confidence, had taken on the dull sheen of constant pain. His breathing was labored, and his massive frame had lost perhaps 50 pounds in just 3 days. The cave he'd chosen was perfect for his needs, deep enough to provide shelter from the increasingly harsh weather, with multiple escape routes and a narrow entrance that would prevent larger predators from cornering him inside. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the ideal place to wait out his recovery. But circumstances were far from normal.
The smell of his blood had been carried on the wind for miles. Every predator in the region now knew that the territory's apex predator was wounded and hiding. And in the brutal mathematics of wilderness survival, wounded meant opportunity. Bruno settled into his cave as the first major blizzard of the season began to howl outside. Snow piled up around the entrance, creating a natural camouflage that might help hide his location. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive this ordeal. But even as he drifted into the fitful sleep of the wounded, shadows were moving through the storm outside. The Clearwater Pack, 7 wolves led by a battle-scarred alpha named Dakota by the researchers who tracked them, had been following Bruno's blood trail for over a day. Unlike the smaller pack Bruno had encountered earlier, the Clearwater wolves were experienced, patient, and absolutely ruthless. They'd brought down elk, moose, and even other bears in the past. Dakota, the pack's alpha female, bore scars from a dozen successful hunts and twice as many territorial disputes. They knew exactly what they'd found hiding in that cave. The attack began to dawn on October 18th, 3 days after Bruno's wounding. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of pristine snow and bitter cold. The temperature had dropped to nearly 20 below zero, and Bruno's breath formed clouds of vapor that lingered in the still air of his cave. He woke to the sound that had haunted his nightmares for days, the low, haunting howl of wolves communicating with each other. But this wasn't distant howling, this was close, very close. Bruno struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder protesting every movement. 3 days of relative rest had helped somewhat. The bleeding had stopped, and some strength had returned to his massive frame. But he was still operating at perhaps 60% of his normal capacity. And in the world of apex predators, that 40% could mean the difference between life and death. The first wolf appeared at the mouth of his cave like a gray ghost materializing from the snow. It was Dakota, the pack's alpha. And even through his pain and exhaustion, Bruno had to admire her magnificent presence. She was smaller than him, certainly, perhaps 90 pounds compared to his reduced but still impressive 750. But she moved with the fluid confidence of a creature absolutely certain of her place in the world's hierarchy. Dakota's yellow eyes met Bruno's dark ones across the cave entrance, and in that moment, both predators understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a territorial dispute or a chance encounter. This was a deliberate, calculated hunt, and Bruno was the prey. The psychological warfare began immediately. The wolves didn't rush in for a quick attack. Instead, they employed the patient, methodical approach that had made them one of nature's most successful predators. They took shifts. 2 wolves would position themselves at the cave entrance just out of Bruno's reach, while the others rested nearby. The guards would pace back and forth, occasionally letting out low growls or aggressive barks, designed to keep their quarry in a state of constant stress. Every few hours, the shifts would change. Fresh wolves would take over the guard duty while the previous team rested and fed. It was a siege in the truest sense of the word, designed to wear down Bruno's defenses through exhaustion and psychological pressure. Bruno understood the strategy. He'd seen wolves employ similar tactics against elk and moose. The prey animal would eventually become so exhausted from constant vigilance that it would make a mistake, venture too far from safety, stumble, or simply collapse from fatigue. Then the pack would strike with devastating efficiency. But Bruno had advantages that elk and moose didn't possess. His cave was perfectly positioned. The narrow entrance meant the wolves couldn't attack en masse, and the multiple passages deeper in the cave system provided potential escape routes. More importantly, he had the intelligence to recognize what was happening and the patience to wait it out. The standoff stretched into its second day. Bruno rationed his energy carefully, sleeping in short bursts when the wolves seemed relaxed, staying alert when they showed signs of increased agitation. He had no access to food or water, but grizzlies were adapted to survive extended periods without either. His fat reserves, built up over the summer months, would sustain him for quite some time. The wolves, meanwhile, were facing their own challenges. They were expending enormous amounts of energy maintaining their siege. And unlike Bruno, they couldn't survive extended periods without food. Dakota was beginning to show signs of frustration. Her pack was unified in their commitment to this hunt, but she could sense that time was working against them. On the third day, the weather turned again. Another storm system moved in, bringing with it howling winds and driving snow that made hunting nearly impossible. This should have been Bruno's salvation. The wolves should have been forced to abandon their siege and seek shelter. Instead, they made a decision that would prove fateful for everyone involved. Rather than retreating to their own territory, the Clearwater Pack chose to wait out the storm in the immediate vicinity of Bruno's cave. They found shelter in a cluster of boulders less than 100 yards away, close enough to maintain their psychological pressure on their quarry, but far enough to avoid any desperate charges Bruno might attempt. It was a calculated risk that demonstrated just how committed they were to this hunt. But it was also a decision that would put them all in grave danger. Because this storm was different from the others. This was the beginning of the massive weather system that would later be called the Halloween blizzard of 2023. A storm that would dump nearly 6 feet of snow across central Alaska and bring temperatures down to levels that challenged even the hardiest of Arctic-adapted creatures. The Halloween blizzard lasted 4 days. 4 days of howling winds that reached speeds of over 60 miles per hour. 4 days of snow that fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to mere inches. 4 days of temperatures that plunged to nearly 40 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. For Bruno, huddled deep in his cave, the storm was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing was obvious. The wolves couldn't maintain their siege in conditions this extreme. They were forced to focus entirely on their own survival, giving Bruno his first real rest in nearly a week. The curse was more subtle but equally dangerous. The massive snowfall was sealing him into his cave. What had been a spacious shelter with multiple escape routes was rapidly becoming a snow-covered tomb. The main entrance was already nearly blocked, and the back passages were filling with drifting snow blown in by the relentless wind. Bruno tried several times to clear the entrances, but his wounded shoulder made the work agonizing, and the snow was falling faster than he could move it. Each attempt left him weaker, and eventually he was forced to accept a terrifying reality. He was trapped. Outside, the wolves were facing their own life-and-death struggle. The shelter they'd chosen among the boulders was barely adequate for weather this extreme. Ice formed in their fur, and the constant winds sucked precious body heat away faster than their metabolisms could replace it. Dakota made the decision that probably saved her pack's lives. On the second day of the storm, she led them away from Bruno's cave and towards a more substantial shelter she remembered from previous winters. A deep ravine nearly 2 miles away where the pack had weathered severe storms before. It was a difficult journey through snow that was already belly-deep on the wolves and getting deeper by the hour. More than once, one of the younger pack members stumbled and had to be helped to their feet by the others. But Dakota's leadership and the pack's cooperation got them through. They spent the remainder of the storm huddled together in the ravine, sharing body heat and conserving energy. It was a miserable 4 days, but they survived.
Bruno, meanwhile, was facing a different kind of hell. Trapped in his cave with no access to food or water, he could only wait and listen to the storm's fury outside. The wound in his shoulder had begun to heal slightly, but the lack of nutrition was taking its toll on his already depleted body. His magnificent frame continued to shrink as his body consumed its own fat and muscle tissue to survive. More troubling was the psychological impact of his confinement. Bruno had never been trapped before. Throughout his life, his response to threats had always been movement, escape, attack, or strategic repositioning. Being unable to control his own mobility was perhaps more torture than the physical pain of his wounds. He tried repeatedly to dig through the snow, blocking his exits, but the combination of his injury and weakened state made progress nearly impossible. Each attempt left him exhausted and discouraged, and slowly a dangerous despair began to creep into his thoughts. By the fourth day of the storm, Bruno had reached his lowest point. Dehydrated, starving, and increasingly convinced that he would die in this cave, the great bear lay motionless on the cold stone floor. His breathing was shallow, his heartbeat irregular, and for the first time in his life, he began to give up hope. But then, on the morning of October 22nd, the storm finally broke. The silence was deafening. After 4 days of constant wind and driving snow, the sudden stillness felt almost unnatural. Bruno struggled to consciousness, his body stiff from cold and inactivity. Weak sunlight was filtering through gaps in the snow that blocked his cave entrance, gaps that hadn't been there the day before. The storm's end had brought a subtle warming trend, and the massive snowdrifts were beginning to settle and compress. More importantly, the wind had carved channels through some of the accumulated snow, creating openings that might, just might, be large enough for a determined grizzly to squeeze through. Bruno summoned strength he didn't know he still possessed. For the next several hours, he worked with single-minded determination to enlarge one of the wind-carved openings. His wounded shoulder screamed with every movement, but the prospect of freedom drove him forward. Pawful by pawful, he clawed and pushed the compacted snow aside. Finally, just as the sun reached its highest point in the pale October sky, Bruno broke through. The world he emerged into was transformed. What had been a familiar landscape of forests and meadows was now an alien realm of snow dunes and ice sculptures. The storm had rearranged the very geography of his territory, burying familiar landmarks under feet of pristine white. But Bruno was free. His first priority was water. Dehydration was becoming a serious threat, and he needed to replenish his body's fluids before he could even think about food. He made his way carefully down the slope toward Clearwater Creek, each step a careful test of his footing on the unstable snow. The creek was still running, though ice had formed along its edges, and snow bridges crossed it in several places. He broke through the thin ice and drank deeply, the cold water shocking his system, but providing desperately needed relief to his parched throat. As he drank, he became aware that he was not alone. Fresh tracks in the snow told a story that made his blood run cold. Wolf tracks, 7 sets of them leading away from his cave area and then circling back. The Clearwater pack had survived the storm, and they'd been checking on their quarry. Bruno lifted his massive head from the water, scanning the tree line with eyes that had regained some of their old alertness. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence. They were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to resume their siege. But something had changed during the storm. The near-death experience in the cave had stripped away some of Bruno's fear and replaced it with a grim determination. He was no longer the confused, panicked creature who'd been shot 5 days earlier. He was still wounded, still weakened, but he was also angry. And an angry grizzly, even a wounded one, was something that even experienced wolves approached with extreme caution. Bruno began moving through his territory with renewed purpose. He needed food desperately. His body was consuming itself to stay alive, and soon he would pass the point of no return. But finding food in this snow-covered wasteland would be nearly impossible. The salmon run was over. The berry bushes were buried under feet of snow. Even the grasses and roots he sometimes relied on were inaccessible. Bruno was facing the prospect of starvation in the midst of his own kingdom. That's when his nose caught a scent that offered hope. Carrion. Somewhere nearby, an animal had died during the storm. The smell was faint but unmistakable, the sweet, sick odor of decomposing flesh that promised nutrition and survival. Bruno began following the scent trail, his wounded gait making the search painfully slow, but his determination absolute. What he found was both a blessing and a curse. The carcass was an elk, a young bull that had apparently been caught in the open when the storm hit and had frozen to death during the first night. It was partially buried in snow, but there was enough exposed meat to feed a grizzly for several days. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly what Bruno needed, but the circumstances were far from normal. The wolf tracks around the carcass told him that the Clearwater pack had found it first. They'd been feeding here using it as their base of operations while they maintained their surveillance of Bruno's cave. Fresh scat and disturbed snow indicated they'd been here as recently as that morning. Bruno was faced with an impossible choice. He desperately needed the nutrition this carcass represented, but claiming it would almost certainly trigger the confrontation he'd been avoiding. In his weakened state, a direct fight with 7 wolves was likely a death sentence. But starvation was a certain death sentence. Bruno made his decision. He approached the carcass slowly, deliberately, his massive head swinging back and forth as he scanned for signs of the pack. The forest around him was silent except for the soft whisper of wind through snow-laden branches. But silence in the wilderness often meant danger, not safety. He'd managed to feed for perhaps 10 minutes, tearing precious strips of frozen meat from the elk's flank, when the first howl split the afternoon air. They were coming. Bruno lifted his blood-stained muzzle from his meal and looked around the clearing where the elk lay. The terrain offered little in the way of defensive advantages. He was in the open, surrounded by forest that could hide approaching wolves until they were almost upon him. His warrior's mind quickly assessed his options. He could try to drag the carcass to better ground, but his wounded shoulder made that impossible. He could abandon the meal and retreat, but he might not get another opportunity like this. Or he could stand his ground and fight for what might be his last meal either way. The second howl came from a different direction, then a third. The pack was surrounding him, using their superior numbers and mobility to cut off his escape routes. Bruno had walked into exactly the kind of trap that wolves had been perfecting for thousands of years. As the sun began to set on October 22nd, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing, Bruno stood over his precious meal and waited for the battle that would determine whether the king of the mountain would live to see another dawn. The first wolf materialized from the tree line like smoke given form.
Dakota emerged from the forest with the confidence of a predator who'd never lost a hunt this close to completion. The alpha female moved with fluid grace across the snow, her pale gray coat making her nearly invisible against the winter landscape. Behind her, the other 6 members of the Clearwater pack began to reveal themselves, stepping out from behind trees and boulders where they'd been positioned in a perfect hunting formation. Bruno found himself
surrounded. These weren't the opportunistic scavengers he'd encountered earlier in his journey. This was a coordinated military operation, executed by some of the most skilled predators in North America. Each wolf had a role to play, and they'd performed this deadly dance many times before. The pack spread out in a loose circle around the clearing, maintaining careful spacing that would prevent Bruno from charging any single wolf without exposing himself to attacks from the others. It was textbook pack hunting strategy, refined over millennia of evolution. Dakota positioned herself directly across from Bruno, perhaps 30 feet away, close enough to communicate her intentions clearly, far enough to avoid any desperate lunges from the wounded bear. Her yellow eyes never left his as she began the psychological phase of the hunt. The howling started low and built gradually. First Dakota, then the others joining in one by one until the forest rang with their song. But this wasn't the territorial howling that wolves use to communicate across long distances. This was something far more primal, a hunting song that spoke of blood and death and the ancient rights of predators. Bruno felt something deep in his bones respond to that sound. Not fear exactly, but recognition. This was how the world had worked for millions of years before humans arrived with their guns and their arrogance. Predator and prey, strength against cunning, life and death balanced on the edge of a moment. He reared up on his hind legs, his massive frame reaching nearly 10 feet into the cold air. Even wounded, even weakened, Bruno was still an awesome sight. His roar, when it came, was like thunder rolling down from the mountains themselves. It spoke of power and defiance and the absolute refusal to go quietly into the dark. The sound echoed off the surrounding peaks and seemed to shake snow from the pine branches overhead. For a moment, even the experienced wolves seemed taken aback by the sheer force of his presence. But then Dakota responded with her own sound, a snarling bark that cut through Bruno's roar like a knife through silk. It was a sound that said, "You're wounded, you're alone, and we are many." The first attack came without warning. One of the younger wolves, a male the researchers had designated Wolf 7, darted in from Bruno's left side, aiming for the wounded shoulder. It was a probing attack, designed to test Bruno's reflexes and reactions rather than cause serious damage. Bruno's response was lightning fast, despite his injuries. His massive paw swept through the air where the wolf had been, missing by inches as the agile predator danced away. But the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his wounded shoulder, and a few drops of blood fell onto the snow. Dakota saw the blood and knew what it meant. The wound was still fresh, still painful, still limiting the bear's mobility. She barked once, a sharp command that her pack understood immediately. The coordinated attack began. 2 wolves came in from opposite sides, while a third circled behind, trying to get at Bruno's hindquarters. It was a classic pack maneuver, designed to divide his attention and prevent him from focusing his considerable strength on any single threat. Spun and slashed, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, but his survival instincts overriding the pain. His claws, each one 4 inches of curved death, whistled through the air inches from gray fur. The wolves were fast, incredibly fast, but Bruno's reach was longer than they'd anticipated. The battle raged for nearly 20 minutes, an eternity in the world of predator encounters. Bruno managed to land one glancing blow on Wolf 4, sending the animal tumbling through the snow with a yelp of pain and surprise. But the effort cost him dearly, and his movements were becoming noticeably slower. Dakota called off the attack with a series of sharp barks. Her pack retreated to a safe distance, panting heavily but essentially unharmed except for Wolf 4's bruised ribs. Bruno remained standing over the elk carcass, but his breathing was labored, and his wounded shoulder was bleeding again. The alpha female studied her quarry with the calculating gaze of a general planning the final assault. The wounded bear was weakening with